Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for dialing into the COVID Q&A. I just want to say quick thank you to Chief Mino and Ms. Henley for making this happen, setting everything up and getting folks dialed in at the right time. Now, we're joined today by Lieutenant Colonel Prochaska, the Installation COVID Response Coordinator, who is probably not busy at all, and Dr. David Naval, Chief of Aerospace Medicine. I appreciate, sorry, I thought that was open. I apologize. I appreciate you taking the time to visit with the 505th. I'm looking forward to this session. And without further ado, Chief Mino, over to you.
Thank you, Colonel Weinbrecht. Ladies and gentlemen, before we get started, this is a friendly reminder to please mute your mics. Good afternoon and welcome 505th Command and Control Wing family to the COVID vaccine Q&A. I am Chief Jacinta Mino and I will be the moderator for today's panel. It is my job to ask the questions that have been sent in. We encourage audience participation from our Zoom viewers today and hope that we receive additional questions from you during the event. There are two ways to submit questions. The first is to ask your questions directly in the chat window. Another way is to submit questions anonymously through the app/website called Meeting Pulse. The link to that page can be found either in the chat window or it was also sent out in the emails to the wing. Of note, an account is not required. The page will pull right up and allow you to type in a question. The reason we are here today is because almost 2 months ago, the first coronavirus vaccine was administered in the United States, and while millions of people have received doses of the vaccine, many more have concerns about its effectiveness and safety. Today, we have brought together experts from the First Special Operations Wing and Medical Group to address your concerns with regards to the different vaccines and Herbert's rollout plan. To the left of your screen, you have Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Prochaska. He is the First Special Operations Wing COVID Response Coordinator. He helps organize, coordinate, develop Herbert policy, and provide advice/recommendations to the installation commander on all things COVID related. To your right is Dr. David Naval. He is a graduate of the University of Tennessee College of Medicine and is currently the Chief of Aerospace Medicine and the Public Health Emergency Officer here at Hurlburt Field. He has been in charge of a lot of the response items since last March, to include a lot of the installation's vaccination efforts. Now that I've introduced our panel members, let's get started. There were a lot of questions submitted via Meeting Pulse, so I will have our guests answer them first. Gentlemen, first question. One of your Facebook posts said it was okay to receive the vaccine if you have underlying conditions. Is this accurate for all conditions, or is it better advice to say you should speak to your PCM first?
Sure. Thank you, Chief. So with this question, it's really important to understand that no two people are exactly alike. So if you do have any questions, I would encourage you to speak with your PCM. That said, the way these vaccines work, the way the mRNA vaccines work, that is the Pfizer and the Mrna vaccines, they are safe with most any underlying condition. The aim of this, of course, is if you have an underlying condition, you're more at risk for having severe effects of COVID itself. So we would absolutely want to immunize those individuals first. And that's part of the rollout plan has been looking at the higher vulnerability populations, initially 75 and older, 65 and older through many of the states and areas. And then part of phase 1 Charlie is looking for the Department of Defense is looking at ages 16 through 64 with those underlying conditions. So those are the people who would actually benefit more from the vaccine itself. And that's specifically looking at the two current vaccines that have an approved EUA, Pfizer and Mrna. There are vaccines in development and one has submitted their paperwork to the FDA. That's the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That is a live vaccine. So people that are immunocompromised, people that are pregnant, they may want to avoid that vaccine. However, without having all the EUA data and all the FDA data that they've released, we really can't say too much about what conditions the manufacturer or the FDA excludes at this time. Because it's a live vaccine, it will probably exclude any, frankly, immunocompromising conditions.
All right, thanks, sir. Second question, if the vaccine doesn't protect you 100% and you still have to wear a mask and follow precautions, what is the value of the shot? especially since they have not had long enough to study the long-term side effects of it.
Copy. So yes, mask wear, hand hygiene, social distancing, those things are going to be in effect for quite some time. The benefit of the shot, you're not just protecting yourself, you're potentially helping decrease the overall disease burden of the community and the population. So when we look at the vaccine studies and look at the data, one of the biggest things we see from the vaccine trials is a decrease in hospitalizations, a decrease in deaths, a decrease in severe effects of the COVID in the population that was immunized. And that's really important to remember, particularly for a number of our younger folks. COVID as a disease doesn't normally strike younger people as hard as it does older people, but it still does have that effect. There's been over 465,000 Americans who've died of this disease. Only 15 of those are in uniform, but that means that we're not exempt from that just because we're younger. It can strike younger people. And indeed, actually in Okaloosa County, there was an individual, I think she was 26 years old, who passed away of COVID. When you look at long-term effects, so COVID as a virus will affect your lungs, can affect your heart. It can affect some of your other symptoms or systems. Some people may have heard about like long haulers with COVID, which is a term that has been applied to some of these folks that have persistent fatigue, persistent, essentially feeling like they have COVID. Those are sort of things that could affect, potentially your military readiness. Certainly could affect, if you do have significant lung effects or heart effects, could affect your ability to fly long-term, could affect your military career. So it's not common, but those are the sorts of things where we would look at, when you look at way out side effects, the vaccine really doesn't have too many significant side effects. The first 48 hours may not be very much fun, but it certainly won't affect your heart and lungs the way the actual virus itself would. So some of that's just protecting yourself from rare, but very real possible outcomes of the virus. And then, like I mentioned, protecting some of the others. There is some evidence out there that, people who are vaccinated are less likely to spread the virus. And that's in particular with some of these newer strains like the South African strain. So we would encourage people to get vaccinated and encourage as many people to get vaccinated as possible from a medical standpoint, just to try to eliminate the disease burden. And that'll actually help decrease the number of these variants that pop up. These mutations happen because the virus can spread amongst different people. So if you have 100,000 people infected, that's more and more chances that the virus is going to change and mutate. But if we cut down on those numbers, then there's less of a chance of mutation, and we can hopefully, get much better control of the pandemic itself. So there's a few different reasons there. I think from an individual standpoint, yes, we're going to have to wear masks. We're going to have to socially distance for some time. The vaccine supply is a big part of that. We just don't have enough to get enough people vaccinated. But just getting it as an individual decision, I think it should be weighing out what are the side effects of the vaccine versus what are the side effects that could happen to me if I did get this virus.
Thank you, sir. That kind of leads in perfectly to my next question. So of the three vaccines, which has the highest protection rate against the most mutations, and what are some of the side effects of the vaccine for each manufacturer?
Yes, copy. So protection rates. So two of the vaccines are mRNA-based vaccines, which is a new type of vaccine. It's a unique way that they've been able to develop them in a unique way that they work. So mRNA technology has been used for other disease processes, particularly genetic diseases or genetic ailments. For a vaccine, this is the first time we've actually had a vaccine based on it. And it's a little bit difficult to describe through it. So I've been using a thumbprint analogy for a lot of it. The way a lot of viruses work and the way your immune system works, your cells have a number of receivers on them, sort of like a thumbprint reader. If the wrong thumbprint hits that reader, the cell will actually grab onto it and say, hey, this isn't supposed to be here. That's where you start getting antibodies and different things developed to whatever that thumbprint was. So most vaccines that you receive, like the influenza and some of the other ones that we receive on a regular basis, you give the body a whole bunch of thumbs that those readers know aren't supposed to be there, and you start making antibodies to that particular protein of that virus so that if you see it again, your body reacts immediately. mRNA actually takes a step back. Your body has the ability to make those proteins through the systems already in place. So what this actually does is give your body the blueprint for the thumb, and allows your body to start making thumbs on its own, just the thumb, nothing else. It gives you the blueprint to make that thumb so that you're able to mount a response and know that that's not supposed to be there. So it lets you get, more significant numbers of thumbs or spike proteins floating around, allows you to get a pretty robust response. And what we've seen, even in some of the people who normally and traditionally don't get good responses to vaccines, like our elderly, we've been seeing phenomenal rates of immune protection for those individuals with these mRNA vaccines. The actual numbers, when you look at Pfizer and Moderna, for getting both shots, the two-shot series, you're looking at 95% or just over 95% effectiveness at preventing significant COVID disease, which is remarkable. For the J&J vaccine, again, we don't have too much of the raw data. What data I've been able to glean is mostly from news articles and a couple of releases the company did themselves. So until the FDA has their EUA statement where they list all the trial data, I'm going to refrain from getting too much in the numbers, but still looks like it is very effective. So I think 65, 66% decrease in COVID burden, somewhere in the 72 to 85% range, depending on which source you look at, for decrease in severe COVID hospitalizations and severe effects of COVID. So still pretty remarkable, not quite the 95% with Pfizer Moderna, but for something that only requires one dose, that's pretty impressive numbers. In terms of side effects per manufacturer, again, for the Johnson & Johnson, I'll kind of have to wait on that one. It's a live vaccine. So you'd anticipate with a lot of live vaccines, for those of you who have kids that got their measles, their MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, or the varicella vaccine, same thing. They usually get sick the day or two afterwards and all. I would anticipate that. However, based on what the manufacturers released, it doesn't look like that many people are getting, bad fevers or anything like that. So we'll have to see what the FDA data shows, but it may be that one actually has pretty significantly less side effects than what Pfizer and Moderna have reported. For Pfizer and Moderna, the big things, arm pain, and I can testify to that. I've gotten my second dose of Mrna last Friday as a healthcare worker, and yes, the arm pain was real. For the first and second shot of Mrna, it's 86% get arm pain, and then 89.9% get arm pain. For Pfizer, the numbers are a little bit less than that, but about 80%. We'll get pretty significant arm pains. About half of folks will get some redness around the site, some swollen lymph nodes, so lumps and bumps around the area. For the rest of the symptoms, so a lot of people report fever, fatigue, chills, just feeling sick, and that usually ranges around 35 to 50% for the first shot and around 50 to 60% for the second shot in both of those manufacturers. The side effect profile is pretty similar for those two. So realistically, you can expect for the first 48 hours after the vaccine, your arm's going to hurt. You may run a headache. You may have some fevers. You're going to feel kind of like you have a cold of some sort.
Happy, thanks, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any allergy impacts between the three vaccines, or whatever you can provide on the Johnson & Johnson, since we don't have that much data? And if people tend to have allergic reactions, which vaccine is better? Okay.
So I honestly don't have too much information on the Johnson & Johnson related to that one. So, and that's part of these conversations. We want people to make informed decisions. So we'll be upfront with what we know and what we don't. I don't know that much about allergic reactions with Johnson & Johnson. I haven't seen a statement from the manufacturer that lists that specifically. For Pfizer and Mrna, significant allergic reactions, and that's anaphylaxis. That's the big one that they always report, and that's where people get swelling in their throat, swelling in their airway, have trouble breathing. That happens pretty rarely, actually. So some of the numbers that were coming out of the original Moderna study, I think they had 2 reactions out of the 37,000 immunized. Now that we've had ongoing data through the Department of Defense, I think there have been 37 potential cases reported through the United States, but this was back when they had immunized only about like 5 or 6 million people. So the rate's still very low for anaphylaxis, and that is the emergent bad allergic reaction. All of those cases at the time had been treated with an EpiPen, which is epinephrine delivery device that you poke into the leg. We don't do any pulp fiction straight in the heart here. We use it appropriately. But all of them had been amenable to that. None of them had required any other significant therapy. So, for Hurlburt Field, we have EpiPens and medical staff on on site, and that is a requirement from the DHA. So every installation, it should be following those guidance. And then we have Eglin ER available too, which would just be for observation if someone were to have a reaction. For other allergic symptoms, there have not been as many reports. Most of the redness, irritation, arm pain things have been side effects, appropriate side effects of the vaccine itself. So not really an allergic reaction, just the fact that you now have, millions of thumbs being printed in your arm muscle. So from an allergic standpoint, the big one is anaphylaxis. It's pretty rare with Pfizer and Moderna. I should point out some of the cases where this did happen. A lot of those individuals had prior history of either anaphylaxis to another vaccine or anaphylaxis to another medication or known anaphylaxis to a known entity. So for people that don't have severe allergies, that have never had an anaphylactic reaction, your chances actually of having an issue with this is incredibly low. If you do have that history, the part of the EUA that the FDA approved advises that those individuals should be monitored for 30 minutes rather than 15, just to ensure that there is no potential allergic issue with receiving that vaccine. So even though that risk is still low for that population, it's a bit higher if you have a history of anaphylaxis. And wherever you go to get immunized, they'll be watching you for 30 minutes rather than the 15.
Okay, thank you, sir. How long does the vaccine last for each manufacturer? And how long after having COVID should you wait to have the vaccine?
All right, copy. So thank you, Chief. That one's interesting. So the first part of that question is a little tougher than the second part. So I'll start with the second part. In terms of waiting after you've had COVID, you technically, as long as you have completed your isolation, you're off of your restriction of movement, and you're released to go back to work, you can receive the COVID vaccine. So there's not really a safety issue with that. It has been discouraged by the CDC and some other state Department of Health agencies, namely because if you've recently had COVID, you should have antibodies to COVID floating around in your system. By our policies, we'll look at 90 days. So, and that's based upon some earlier CDC decision memo evidence from fall of last year. If you have an active COVID infection for the next 90 days, you should still have antibodies floating in your system. You should be relatively protected so that if you're exposed, your chance of getting COVID is much lower. We've seen actually in some recent trials that it's closer to 5 months in a lot of individuals. So knowing that you've recently had COVID, you're probably reasonably protected from catching COVID again for a good period of time. So a lot of those recommendations out of the CDC and the state health departments are trying to discourage people who may have antibodies already floating around their system from getting a vaccine in place of someone who does not have antibodies. So it's not so much a safety issue, it's just a matter of trying to get the vaccine into the more vulnerable people as quickly as possible. From a safety standpoint, the CDC and the DHA policy actually states that when you're off of that isolation, you should be able to get the vaccine. For our purposes here at Hurlburt Field, we've been encouraging folks as soon as they're off of isolation, if you're in that phase 1 alpha bracket where we're immunizing people, or if you're dipping into that phase 1 Bravo, go ahead and get immunized, because if you're deploying, we're going to be, making sure that we're keeping our deployers safe, not that it's a deployment requirement, but just trying to minimize, our effects on any international flights and missions. If you're a healthcare worker, first responder, we know you've had COVID. We know you probably have, antibodies floating around, but let's go ahead and, for sure get those people immunized as quickly as possible. So we have been encouraging people as soon as they're off isolation to go in and get immunized. The first part of that question, how long does the vaccine last for each manufacturer? So this is part of where some of the EUA issues start to pop into play. We had really robust immune responses in the trials for Pfizer and Mrna. I mean, over 95%, even in the elderly population, right there at 95%. That's really impressive. How long does that last? We know with an active infection, you typically get 3 to 5 months of immunity. 3 months is kind of the standard policy by the DHA and the Air Force. For the vaccine itself, it looks like it's much longer. So we've got data on folks that are stretching out 6-7 months. And the plan is based upon what they're seeing from people's immune levels that you would not necessarily need a booster, but there's really not a guarantee to that. So that was the plan behind some of, like I mentioned, measles, mumps, rubella. That's a live vaccine. when that came out, it was supposed to be a one shot when you're turning 1 and you're done. And then, a decade later, we're seeing school children getting outbreaks and all. And so now every 4 or 5-year-old goes in and gets a booster. So that may very well happen. There's no guarantee that people won't require a booster or a subsequent vaccine, a year, 2 years, 3 years from now. But the thought is that based upon the mRNA vaccine and based upon what they've seen, it should be good to cover people for at least a few years. It's not a guarantee, and that's part of this being an EUA, emergency use authorization, as opposed to a formal approval. We just don't have the long-term effectiveness data. So speculation would be it's probably going to be good for a while, at least a few years, but I would not be surprised if we're getting boosters at some point down the road. I wouldn't be surprised by a lot, but that's one of the things that would not surprise me.
Yes, sir. So you kind of talked about once you're healed, quote unquote, healed from the virus, that you still have antibodies in your system. So this next question, can you still be a COVID carrier even after you've had the vaccine?
Correct. So the Johnson & Johnson piece is going to be difficult to tell because it is a live vaccine. They did not, I haven't seen any of their materials that they've remarked that you potentially could spread the disease after receiving that vaccine, but that's always a potential concern with the live vaccine. For Moderna and Pfizer, so the vaccine themselves cannot get you the disease because it's just printing a blueprint for a thumb, right? It's a blueprint to produce a spike protein that is one small piece of a virus and can in no way infect someone and replicate and all those things. So the vaccines themselves from that standpoint are safe. From a long-term standpoint, if you've been vaccinated, can you catch COVID? Yes. So similar to influenza, some other things, if you get a high enough burden on the system, you can still have the virus replicate within you while your body's playing catch up, your immune system's playing catch up. So it can happen. It has happened. We've seen that actually, particularly for folks between their first and second dose. There were some areas, and this was seen internationally in a couple of places too, where people got their first dose, were a little bit more lax with some of the precautions, got infected, and then had to get their second dose either a week late or were able to get it on time, but they had a documented COVID infection between the 2 doses. We have seen people get COVID after both doses, although that's rare. The key is that, again, part of the function of the vaccine and part of the benefit of it is your risk of hospitalization, your risk of death, your risk of severe disease is much lower. And that's, you can still catch it. That's how these trials are conducted. They immunize people, they don't immunize people, and then they see what the rates are. So people in both groups got sick. The people, obviously, in the not immunized group got more significant illnesses and a lot more illnesses. So it's still there. The vaccine, these 2, Pfizer and Moderna, can't get you sick, but there's always that chance that you can catch COVID after this.
So do you anticipate this being an annual vaccine like the flu shot?
So the speculation on some of the long-term stuff is a bit tricky. From a Pfizer Moderna standpoint, I don't, but again, it could happen that we require a booster down the road. Live vaccines, so the Johnson & Johnson live vaccine may require a booster. It's only 1 dose for the Johnson & Johnson, which is pretty remarkable that they're able to get a really good immune response from that 1 dose. They may have to have a booster at some point down the road, similar to our measles, mumps, rubella, but I don't know if it's going to be an annual requirement. I will say, just in regards to some of the other strains and things that are coming out, because some of the boosters were talked about for South African strain and the UK strain. The way mRNA vaccines are engineered, it actually allows the scientists to manipulate those spike protein segments, substitute in different mRNA particles to make sure that it's the right protein for that virus. So these new strains, even though our current existing vaccines are pretty effective against them, they can modify those vaccines for new strains relatively easily. And that's one of the advantages of this, as opposed to some of the live vaccine methods and all, or some of the traditional vaccine methods. These are a good bit manipulatable, so we can adjust them to new strains as they pop up if we need to. And that might down the road, if we do see more and more new strains popping up, lead to boosters.
Okay. After you get Pfizer's, Moderna's, or J.J.'s vaccine, when do you have to get the next one?
Sure. So Pfizer vaccine is ideally 21 days. So that 3-week mark, 21 days. Moderna is 28 days. There is allowance to give the vaccines up to 4 days early if we absolutely need to. And that's in the CDC guidance as well. The vaccines can be given essentially the second dose, though, if you can't make that 21 or 28 day mark, they can be given whenever you are available. So in this original Pfizer study, it was up to day 42. We've got some data on folks that are past that mark. And so that's where the CDC has released guidance saying, whenever you can get that second dose, if it's past the 21, 28, if it's past that 42 day mark, whenever you can get it, and it will still count as a valid second dose without need for any restarting the series or any other boosters. For J&J, part of the selling point with that one is that it is a single vaccine, single dose. So should not need any boosters for that.
Okay. How long from the first or final shot is it effective? And what percentage rate per manufacturer are the vaccines effective?
Right. So gets a little trickier when you're digging through some of the data. So Pfizer and Moderna, we actually see pretty good effectiveness about a week after the second dose, which is where some were studied. Full effectiveness might take up to a month after the second dose, but we're still seeing really remarkable numbers pretty shortly after that second dose. And J&J's study, I think, had people measured at 14 days and 28 days. And for both of those groups, they saw pretty robust uptake. So it's pretty quickly after you complete the series. For a single dose, if you're a single dose of Pfizer or Moderna, for one reason or another, I'm not entirely sure the efficacy there. I know there have been some published reports, but I haven't seen any consistent data to give you a good answer on that one.
Okay, copy. Ladies and gentlemen, this is just a friendly reminder to submit your questions via chat or meeting pulse. And give our board members, panel members, a chance to get some water. I believe I've already asked this question, sir, but I just want to make sure. Why should I get the vaccine if I still have to wear a mask and take precautions?
Yes, yeah. So just to foot stomp some of that, there's a lot of reasons for the vaccine itself. Part of this, again, is from a community standpoint, we're just trying to decrease the overall disease burden. And yes, masks, social distancing, hand hygiene, those play a huge role in that, but vaccination does too. So the more we can knock down this virus, the quicker we can knock down this virus, the less mutations we're looking at. And I mean, ultimately, that's lives saved down the road. In terms of personal decision-making, I really encourage folks to look at the side effect profile of the vaccine itself. We talked a little bit about some of the side effects. The actual data tables that list the side effects in terms of the common side effects, they're available publicly. So if you Google Pfizer COVID vaccine for providers, it's a lengthier document. The one that's for vaccine recipients is really only about 6 pages, and I think the Moderna is right about that too. If you look at the one for providers, if you Google the document EUA for providers for either manufacturer, you'll get about a 27 to 30 page document. In that is the table that looks at the side effects of arm pain, redness, fatigue, fever, nausea, those sorts of things are listed for the vaccine, for placebo, for dose 2 of the vaccine, for placebo. So you can look at those charts and see some of the data that we look at ourselves and kind of make that decision versus what are the potential side effects of the COVID virus itself. And that's where, I think a lot of people think that, well, I'm younger, it may not affect me, or, it only affects a small percentage of people in certain ways, but it's all a risk, and everyone has to make that personal risk assessment for where you're at, what your comorbidities, what your other conditions might be, and decide for themselves. But looking at the side effect profile, there's not too many long-term things that we've found. It's mostly those 48 hours of feeling rather sick. So weighing that against the small risk of a long-term effect of the actual virus itself, I think is critical.
Yes, sir. It looks like we're moving into the whole testing process for the vaccine. So regarding the vaccine testing process, what was removed from the process that allowed these vaccines to be ready in less than a year?
Right. So the remarkable thing was that honestly, there wasn't really anything that was removed from a barrier standpoint. So the manufacturers had to go through all the same steps to get their vaccine to where it was, and that's really this whole effort's a testament not just to what we can do as a country, but this is a really huge international effort with a lot of funding that went into it to get the vaccines as quickly through all the hurdles as they did. They did not skip any corners going into that. The reason that we were looking at it, emergency use authorization rather than full approval, some of that is just because we don't have some of the long-term efficacy data and the long-term effect data. So without those things in hand, it really falls into, they completed everything all the way up through the phase 3. We just don't have everything beyond that. So typically for full approval of vaccines, you look at circling back with a couple of years of data to figure out what happened, how effective is it long term. In this case, they had a product that was effective when they submitted that package, which was a good 60 to 90 days for most of the individuals in that trial after they had received the vaccine itself. And so the FDA was able to move forward. It met all the same safety criteria as a normal vaccine at that point in time. So it's really just a matter of knowing some of the long-term pieces. When you look at what we have now, though, it's only a matter of time, I think, before the FDA actually re-examines this, and then the manufacturers have been kind of testing the waters with this. Normally, we look at those individuals who receive the vaccine, we'll study them for a long period of time and get a certain number of person years, person days of being vaccinated to see all the different side effects that can happen that might be more rare. In this case, we've actually got over 100 million people worldwide now that have been immunized. So we've got a vast amount of data on these people, much more than we would normally see in any kind of vaccine. We just don't have the long-term piece, but we still have enough data to have teased out a lot of the really rare side effects that happen with certain viruses. Not seeing them, which is very reassuring. But that's the one piece that kept it from being a formal approval. At the time, we just didn't have any of that long-term data or the large, robust data that we normally see in terms of person years. With the number of people we've immunized now, the person years data point, we're pretty high up above what would normally be for FDA approval. Just a matter of really, it's kind of uncharted waters for the manufacturer. So it's a matter of when they're willing to resubmit the package and what the FDA director would be looking for in that.
Yes, sir. So hold that thought, because the next question is a follow-on to the whole FDA approval process.
Gotcha.
Let's give our doc a break on this. We have a Herbert specific question. So sir, for Herbert's vaccine rollout, are you finished with the 1 alpha group? If not, how long do you expect it to be complete?
Well, actually, I'm gonna
That'll work. We're never finished with our groups for Hurlburt Field. So when we received our vaccine, it was a bit of a transition time and some policies. So originally we had planned for everyone to roll through the vaccine pod. That plan changed to say that we didn't necessarily have to get paper documentation on people who were refusing the vaccine at the time. That has reversed itself. So the vaccine, we actually have a pod tomorrow, a point of distribution for vaccine tomorrow for individuals who receive their first dose on or before, was it January 14th, I think was that holiday weekend. So those individuals will be getting their second dose tomorrow. At the end of that pod, we are going to have some leftover vaccine. I say leftover, there's always a little bit of extra wiggle room in there for people that are on leave or TDY and all, that we will be offering to our, again, to our phase 1 alpha. So first responders, medical personnel at that time. The plan from an Air Force rollout standpoint is we are going to get resupplied with 100 doses per week. Hopefully starting this week. We did receive 100 doses, so we do have a little bit extra buffer there too. And that should be a consistent shipment moving forward. So we can actually have some, good measure that for those who aren't getting their second dose tomorrow, we will have a supply for next week. We will have a supply for the week after that. It's just going to be in smaller numbers. We are working through our 1 alphas again, and that is primarily who we're looking at getting for, again, first time offering of vaccines tomorrow afternoon at 1600. We do need to have now by policy full accountability of those individuals. And that is on the form 207, which is your signature that says that I accept this vaccine or decline it. Those have been sent out with some of the battle staffs. There have been new versions of them released to change some of the verbiage. But that document for all of our active duty personnel, we will need to get that in hand or to the medical group at some point to upload into their file and mark them in the system as a yes receive or no, I'm refusing at this time. We're going to do that in the step by step, stage by stage. So we do have an account set up, an email account that can receive those encrypted. We're going to work through our 1 alphas to get all those answers questioned and then move into the 1 Bravo population. It may be as early as within a 2-week mark that we can move to that point. But we're still primarily, we're going to get the second dose of those individuals, and then we really have to go through and get 100% accountability of all of our phase 1 alpha by the current policy.
I have a follow-on question to that. So if I decide I sign it at this point, but in the future I want to actually volunteer to get the shot, can I still volunteer?
Absolutely. So very good point. Thank you, President. When you submit that form, you know, when the time comes when we say, hey, okay, it's this phase, we're at this tier, these individuals, you know, either say yes and get the shot over at our pod or submit a declination form to us. If you decline and a week later you say, you know what, I want to get it, that is still an open invitation for those individuals. So it's really easy from our end. We just change the little button in ASIMS, which is the medical record system that tracks readiness. And we'll have that scanned in your medical record. So, you know, here's the yes one when you got your vaccine. So it is pretty easy. You don't have to do anything. It's just the next time we have vaccine on hand, come and get your vaccine.
So sort of a follow-on to that, sir. At the moment, this is just a voluntary option for the military.
Correct.
At some point, do you think this will become another mandatory vaccination for active duty members?
At some point, from a speculation standpoint, I would imagine at some point, yes. You know, this virus, it's proven itself to be quite devastating from, you know, when you look at national statistics, when you look at international statistics, this is a very devastating virus. So I do anticipate this being a part of readiness at some point. Now that typically requires, and the line that they would look at is the FDA formally approving this vaccine. So if the FDA formally approves this vaccine, then we can say that it's not necessarily elective, at least for uniformed members. The other item, there are levels of the executive branch, and I think it's frankly only the president, but can potentially mandate that. I don't see that anytime in the near future, simply because we don't have a robust supply of vaccine. But as we get more vaccine, as we get more data, the FDA, whenever they give their formal approval, that's going to be the piece that the Air Force and the DoD needs to say that is either a mandated readiness item or not.
Okay. Sorry, there's a lot of
that's okay.
Sort of coming in, but it applies across the board. Can you tell me, what is the medical community seeing with respect to influenza over the last 11 months as we deal with COVID?
Absolutely. So this is where we got to knock on wood. Influenza, actually, our rates of influenza locally have been quite low. So there have been a few sporadic cases within Okaloosa, Santa Rosa County area, but no outbreaks throughout the entire panhandle of Florida to date, which is remarkable. Normally this time of year, we've seen outbreaks throughout much of the United States, much of Florida, but we're not really seeing that from a nation standpoint. We're certainly not seeing that from a local area standpoint. So some of the social distancing, mask wear, hand hygiene items are really paying off in what we're seeing from influenza. I also have to kind of foot stomp. We did a really good job of getting our influenza vaccines rolled out. This installation in particular, we were able to immunize people very early, so that always helps. But a lot of these preventative measures that we've seen out in the community are really having a great effect on what is so far a very uneventful flu season.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, going back to the FDA approval process. Will these vaccines ever be made to go through the FDA approval process, or will they continue to be pushed with no extended testing indefinitely?
So I should point out that they did go through the FDA approval process. So that's where the emergency use authorization came from. So the FDA looked at them with all of their safety data and did do their approval, just with the caveats, and that's where it makes an extent the emergency use authorization. From a data standpoint, they are continually collecting data. So with this virus in particular, we always have our vaccine adverse events reporting system. So every provider has always had that available to them for any vaccine. That's how we primarily report vaccine side effects. There's also a safe vaccine app that has been made related to the COVID vaccine for people to report. And that data is continuously being evaluated and collected by both the CDC and the DoD just to validate one, to make sure we're documenting any and all side effects that we're seeing. And then that information is going to be presented to the FDA if they're going to do a formal full approval of the vaccine. Where it is right now and how it got there, though, it did get vetted through the full FDA approval process. They're able to do it quickly, namely because of all the funding and all the international partnerships that were involved in getting it through each step. But the formal approval is going to depend on resubmission with some of the data they have now. But it is continually being studied, and all of the data is being collected to a T. You can actually go to the CDC website and see down to the single person how many millions of Americans have been vaccinated, and all of the side effects of those vaccines are being accounted for. All the ones that are reported are being accounted for.
Okay. So what I gathered from that is the vaccines, both vaccines, have gone through the whole FDA approval process.
Correct. So they went through the same approval process as any other vaccine would for the, going through all the phase 1 to phase 3. The approval is emergency use authorization because it didn't have any of the long-term effect studies. But at this point in time, we again have a pretty large amount of data to look at for any of those rare side effects and other things that could be missed in an initial trial. So the formal approval process more than likely could occur within this calendar year. It just all depends on what the manufacturers want to push through. But all the data that we're getting from the people immunized, that is all being collected, that is all being examined. So we are still, the manufacturers, the CDC, the DoD, we're still very much so collecting all the data that, on this vaccine that we can.
Okay, I only asked that, sir, because the next couple of questions talks about the FDA approval process.
Gotcha.
Okay, there was discussion about airlines, concerts, and other organized events requiring a vaccine passport with COVID vaccine to travel or attend select events. Is that a possibility?
So that's a tricky one too. I mean, certainly for any like private companies, organizations, they're kind of free to do what they want. From a federal standpoint, again, is similar to the question about readiness and will it be mandated. Can't really mandate it if it's not readily available to everyone and if it hasn't received the final FDA full approval authorization. So for certain things, certain venues that are private companies and all, they can absolutely mandate however they see fit. However, going forward right now, I don't see that as something that, domestic airlines, other areas where more people are utilizing that resource are going to have that mandate. And a lot of it is just supply demand. We don't have the supply to be able to get enough people. So if a company is going to say that they require it, that's going to significantly cut down on their consumer base.
Yes, sir. So if you haven't gotten COVID by now, why not continue using precautions and not risk taking a not fully vetted vaccine?
Gotcha. So the fully vetted, I think we kind of hit on this a little bit. It did go through the same processes as a normal vaccine. It's just the long-term piece, and I always encourage folks, take a look at that CDC dashboard and just see the numbers, because at some point it's going to cross the threshold where, okay, well, 50 million Americans have gotten it. We're not seeing too much. Maybe it is, or 100 million, whatever that is in your mind that kind of sets the stage that it might be safer than take a look at that. So from a vetting standpoint, discuss that a little bit. But absolutely, I mean, taking the standard precautions and maintaining those, that is absolutely critical. The vaccine does not substitute those, but there are still good reasons for individuals to get the vaccine. Take a look at your personal risk, take a look at the side effects, take a look at the data that's out there. I mean, anybody can read through the emergency use authorization stuff that the manufacturers released. Anyone can go to the CDC website and look through both their data and their educational materials. Continuing to use precautions is going to keep you safe as possible, but from what we've seen and what we're seeing across the country, it's not 100%. Anything you can do to add a layer to that Swiss cheese is ideal, because what we're seeing still is, numbers are as a country going down, but 130, 140,000 new cases a day. It's better than 250 to 300, but it's still not as good as where we were last summer. It's still not as good as where we were 3 months ago. So, the more we can do to decrease the disease burden, the better.
Yes, sir. So are positive cases of COVID being treated with the vaccine, or is this more of a preventative measure?
Right. So this is strictly preventative measure. Positive cases of COVID, there are a number of medications out there, particularly for people that have severe COVID, that have proven effectiveness. I'll be honest, I don't track those as much. I mean, when they're being released in some of the articles like Medical Letter in the New England Journal of Medicine, I usually keep tabs on those. However, most of our hospitalized cases are either going to Fort Walton Beach and Eglin. So those individuals know a lot more about the current treatments for COVID. This is strictly a preventative measure. So if you do catch COVID, they would wait for you to clear the infection before they would immunize you.
If a member has an opportunity to receive the vaccine off base, should they? And can they provide proof to the med group so it's annotated in their records?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, Chief. So if you do get the vaccine off base, whether, the eligible population off base right now locally is 65 and older, that's going to open up and change, as more people get supplies here and there. So if you're able to get it off base and you're able to secure that, excellent. Just bring in the certificate or proof of your vaccination to our immunization clinic, and we can upload that in the record. Same goes even for our active duty individuals that are younger. If they're able to get it off base for whatever supply demand reason pops up, they absolutely can bring it in. We'll upload it in their record. So it should not be an issue.
Okay. And are you talking, is that Herbert specific, or does that apply across?
So that's actually has been brought up from a DHA standpoint. So the DHA director himself has stated that people are allowed to get it off base and have it uploaded in the record. It is in the prior mods. I'm pretty sure it's in mod 7 of the current vaccine guidance, but that should be across the board from an Air Force standpoint, actually from a DoD standpoint.
Since none of the vaccines are 100% effective, what is the likelihood of still contracting COVID? Similarly, what is the likelihood of being asymptomatic carrier?
Right. So that's a tricky one. A lot of that depends on what's going on in your community. The likelihood of an asymptomatic carrier here, it's a little bit lower than it was 2-3 weeks ago, but still pretty high. When you look at the vaccine effectiveness, some of the stuff that's come out, at least the preliminary reports from the J&J manufacturer itself on their vaccine, some of the reports that have come out in relation to Pfizer and Mrna, there is a decreased chance of being an asymptomatic carrier. It's not, obviously, it still happens. It's not 100%, but that risk will always be there with these vaccines. So we are cutting down on the overall disease burden, but we're not going to eliminate 100% all of those sorts of things. So that sort of gets to the answer. I mean, nothing's 100%, and it's really difficult to kind of speculate on where Johnson & Johnson is going to fall into that. We have some of their manufacturers' data, but ultimately there are still going to be asymptomatic carriers out there, and that's one of the really troublesome things about this virus is that you can shed it for up to 2 days before you really start to have symptoms. There's even evidence that that last day where you're asymptomatic before you start shedding might even be your most contagious point too. So it's difficult.
Copy. Thanks, Sam. What are the recommendations for women who are pregnant or breastfeeding? Is the vaccine recommended for them, and what, if any, are potential impacts and for newborn children?
Sure.
As well?
So we'll not speak to the J&J vaccine on that one simply because it is a live vaccine. So I do anticipate that they will not recommend it for pregnant women. More than likely will not recommend it for breastfeeding women, but I'm not sure from that population standpoint. It really depends on what they're able to see. So the virus itself does not have too many major effects on pregnancy. It can obviously get a member very sick. So if a female, who is pregnant is very sick, that can have adverse things. But the virus itself doesn't necessarily attack any of the reproductive organs. So that's reassuring. It's not like mumps or some of these others that can have long-term infertility impacts. So the vaccine itself, when it was released, particularly because it was Pfizer and Mrna, it's not the entire virus that's being released, it's one protein. So people who are building up this immune response, having the reaction, it shouldn't necessarily affect any pregnancy or fertility items. So that led the CDC to release a recommendation saying that pregnant women, women who are breastfeeding should receive the vaccine. People who are receiving infertility treatments can still get the vaccine. And that was the CDC stance. There's a little bit of confusion because the World Health Organization kind of pushed back on that initially and said, well, we don't have evidence in pregnant women, so we're not going to say anything. The initial trials, so anytime vaccines are going through trials, anytime new medications are going through, they usually exclude people with pre-existing conditions. So pregnancy was one of the excluded conditions when Pfizer and Mrna started their trials. Now that we've started immunizing more people, we do have data in over 20,000 pregnant women who've been immunized without seeing any adverse effects. So it does appear to be very safe in pregnant women. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, which is the big professional organization that gives us a lot of our guidelines for that, they have recommended the vaccine pretty strongly, actually, in their guidance. The CDC and now the World Health Organization are all behind encouraging pregnant women to get the vaccine. That is, however, kind of going back to that first question, a conversation that folks can have with their PCM. So that's one of the ones where it pretty consistently from start to finish, even though the CDC is recommending it, they do recommend talking with your obstetrician, talking with your primary care manager, if you're breastfeeding. So work through those things with your provider, but they are encouraging the vaccine in those populations. It does appear to be safe. There have been, like I say, over 20,000 pregnant women who have received the vaccine at this point, either Pfizer or Mrna. So it does appear to be safe.
That's kind of a follow-on to that question. I'm not sure if you would have the data to this. So of those pregnant women, what of those actually gave birth, or how many of those actually gave birth, and healthy babies?
I do not have that data, actually. And I think some of that too, I mean, this has only been in the last couple of months, right? So a lot of those women are probably still pregnant. But I actually don't have the data on that piece. There is, from what I'm able to get from the CDC website through my access, I am able to see how many pregnant women have been immunized, but I don't know long-term outcomes. I know Dr. Fauci spoke to it in a recent conference, didn't remark on any adverse effects or any children that have been born with any bad effects. So they were still encouraging it. So
Yeah, thanks. Can you donate blood if you have had the vaccine?
Yes, yes. The Johnson & Johnson is a live vaccine. There may be a period of time where they recommend against it. Similar to if you actually have coronavirus, you should be in isolation in your domicile, right? You should be at home, not around other people donating blood. So that one might actually have a clause with it to say, avoid donating blood for a certain period of time or stay home for a certain period of time. We don't know too much about what that one's going to say with it, which is probably a good time to talk about flyers as well with that. But for donating blood, for Pfizer and Mrna, it will not have any effect on your ability to donate blood. Having had the Mrna, and it hurt like the dickens, frankly, that shot, the second shot, I felt it pretty good that night and the next day. It was a little bit worse than anthrax. For those of you who've gotten anthrax, I'd say it's a good bit worse than anthrax. So I don't know that I want to donate blood right after that one. But once those 48 hours are over, honestly, for me, it was like hour 30, I was back to 100%. You can go back and donate blood.
So would you recommend the live or mRNA vaccine?
Right now, we only have the EUA for the mRNA vaccine. So that's the only one that has been approved. So at this point in time, I would say the mRNA vaccine. The Johnson & Johnson, will have to see. I mean, the fact that it's one dose, the fact that they're stating that they can get it out in large numbers, I think, it's got effectiveness behind it, at least from what they're reporting. So, I mean, I would encourage folks to get whichever one is available. And then I think we'll talk about a little bit of the caveats. So the vaccines for flyers, anyone who receives the vaccine is on flying status. It is a 48-hour verbal DNIF for Pfizer and Mrna. So you should not be flying for 48 hours. The source of that, frankly, is not Department of Defense. It's not Air Force. It's the FAA. So the FAA requires 48 hours, cannot be in airspace controlling after you receive the vaccine. So we have to kind of follow suit with the FAA. We can't use their airspace and not adhere to the rules. So that's where the 48-hour verbal DNIF is. It is verbal, it doesn't go into anything. You don't have to talk to your flight doc to go back up, at least by Hurlburt Field policy. So 48-hour DNIF for Pfizer and Mrna, and that's with each dose. So dose 1, dose 2, 2 48-hour periods. The Johnson & Johnson is a live vaccine. So we don't know, again, I don't know too much of the big side effect profile. I've read through some of what they've listed and it seems pretty minimal. But really the opinion that matters when they look at that after FDA gives them their EUA, if they do, is what the FAA sees for that. So for anyone who is a flyer, until we know what the FAA is going to say about the vaccine and what DNIF period they may require when receiving it, I might lean towards the known 48-hour DNIFs of Pfizer and Mrna. Not to say that, I fear that something bad is going to happen with Johnson & Johnson, but it really depends on what the FAA decides for their DNIF period with that one. If they say that it's your DNIF for a week after receiving it, then that could factor into how people plan their missions and mission sets. So until we know how that's going to affect flying, I might lean towards Pfizer and Mrna, but strictly for that population for that reason.
Yes, sir. And just to clarify something, when you say flyer, you're not just talking about pilots. You also referring to like controllers behind the aircraft, somebody that's controlling aircrafts from the ground.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is anyone on flying status, jumping status, or controlling status.
I've heard the vaccine is categorized as experimental. Is this true? If so, how is this different than the flu vaccine we received?
Right. So it is under an experimental use authorization. That is an FDA category which allows people to use the vaccine, allows us to essentially offer it to volunteers, but it does not have the formal full approval where they can mandate that everyone gets it. And that's namely because, again, some of the long-term data is the long-term effect data isn't quite there yet. Although, again, looks like we're getting pretty close in terms of how many people we've immunized and the amount of data we have now. Looking at everything from just like a overall picture, we're not seeing big shortcuts. There's no shortcuts that were taken. This went through all the right steps. It has the EUA in place, yes, but it's not because it's necessarily experimental. It still went through all the safety steps that every other vaccine was released. Flu vaccine, there's a couple of different ways. There's the protein-based vaccine. There are live flu vaccines that, like Flu Mist, the one that goes in the nose. We don't use that as much anymore, but still available, still a valid way to immunize folks against the flu. That one, the flu's been around for a long time. There's a lot of different strains. A lot of different mutations out there. So we try to make least the scientists behind everything, try to make the right vaccine for the right strains that are circulating or that they predict will circulate through. So that's where you get in these annual boosters, because there's just so many different mutations out there that you never know which one quite is going to float through your area. So it's a little bit different from that standpoint. The flu vaccines are all based on, even though they do change the strain around a little bit, they're all based on the same technology that has been vetted through the FDA. A lot of the strains that we get are strains that have been used before. So the strains this year may be the same as the ones 10 years ago and the same as the ones 20 years ago. Even when something novel pops up, like the avian flu or the swine flu, those immunizations are still using the same technique, same profiles, so they're able to kind of more or less get grandfathered into the same FDA approval items. So it's a little bit, part of this is that it's the mRNA vaccine that's the EUAs there in place, but flu vaccine is a little bit different in that regard.
Happy. So speaking of virus mutations, is there anything being done with the first two vaccines in order to combat those mutations or variations we're already seeing in the virus?
Right. So the good news is that the first two vaccines appear, so Pfizer and Mrna appear to work against some of the new mutations, at least from what we've been able to see so far. So they doesn't look like they're going to have to change too much about it. They can, however, the way these vaccines are made, they can actually manipulate the mRNA. They can actually change it out so that they can produce any of these new strains. Kind of like the flu, you know, we grow out different strains. We had the different strains. We make sure that we can account for those depending year by year. The mRNA, they're actually able to engineer those. So if there is a new mutation, they identify a new mutation in the protein, like they've done with South Africa. They can take that spike protein, they can take the thumb and they can change it from this one to the B1351 that's South Africa. They can make that happen actually pretty easily with it. Right now, it doesn't appear that they need to, because the protein that's being generated is still effective against that vaccine strain or that viral strain. So right now we're in good shape. If new mutations do pop up, though, they are able to relatively quickly, once they identify them, change the vaccine if they needed to.
Happy. So we have time for one more question.
All right.
And hopefully, Colonel Casca will be able to answer this for us. Can you please provide estimates on when each segment of the Herbert population will receive the vaccine?
Again, I'll adopt this out.
Yeah.
Honestly,
It really does. Exactly. Yeah. Just like you said, it really depends. If we're getting 100 vaccines a week, if you're accounting for folks getting the first and second dose and you do a little math, it doesn't take long to figure out that it'd take, until 2024 or 25 for us to get the installation done. We are going to be getting large shipments in and around, but we don't have a good idea of when exactly those will be. Our phase 1 Bravo, our numbers that we put out there's a lot of people that fall into that. It includes, and it's important to always remember that, it includes people 75 and older that are beneficiaries in the community. So it's not just our on-base population, but it's our off-base population that we're accounting for with that. It's going to take some time to get through all of that, get through some of those vulnerable populations before we're able to release it to too many other folks. So we don't know when the next ones are coming. There may be this 100 per week. That's really not enough for us to make a sizable mark on some of our 1 Bravo population. But there are Air Force is tracking, DHA is tracking that we're supposed to be getting a lot more of these vaccines from the manufacturers, directly from the manufacturers as we move forward. So hopefully it won't be too long that we get too many. Frankly, Hurlburt Field is, when we stood up our pod, we can clear through a lot of individuals at once from the immunization and safely observe them, following all the right protocols. We have a really high throughput operation over there. So if they give us a lot of vaccine, we are ready. We just need the supply. It's going to take some time.
Sorry, I lied. One more question.
Oh, okay.
How well does this vaccine work with getting other vaccines / shots? So like the flu vaccine, pneumonia, and any interactions with these?
Correct. So good point. We're not seeing, and originally actually it was slated that you could get the vaccine in and around the time. So the first time we had our tabletop exercise, one of our do outs was to plan for immunizing people against the flu at the same time they got the COVID vaccine, which is safe based upon what we've seen through data. However, it's not recommended anymore. And that's namely because we're really trying to isolate what the side effects of the COVID vaccine are. So the current guidance from the DHA, that got scrapped and pushed. We were already, actually, our influenza rate was already at 95% immunized across the installation. So we really didn't have much flu vaccine to give in the first place. But the idea behind the efforts of saying don't get this vaccine at the same time of others is really to be able to tease out what this vaccine caused versus something else. So the guidance is 2 weeks, 14 days from the vaccine, 14 before, 14 after. Don't get any other vaccines. It's really just so that we're able to try to get more accurate data. There's not too many other safety precautions with that. There may be some leeway going forward, particularly with some of our deployers to getting vaccines within that 14-day time frame. That has been discussed. It's not in formal writing yet, but chances are they are going to be releasing some guidance on that. For now, we say 2 weeks before, 2 weeks after, and it's really just so that we know what the vaccine's causing versus what something else might have caused. From a safety standpoint, we know the flu shot can be given with it, but we're not at this time.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mhm.
So that's all the time we have for questions today. I believe
Sure.
I've asked all the questions that were submitted previously and
All
in the
right.
chat. But for our audience that's listening in, if you have further questions, don't hesitate to put it in the chat window and we can forward those along to Dr. Naval. And at this time, sir, I'd like to turn it over to each of you guys for any parting thoughts.
Sure.
I have nothing. No, this has been great. Thanks for letting us come out here and talk to you guys and spread the news about the vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a pleasure to get out here and speak with folks. I think, my biggest thing, again, I want people to make an educated decision. Obviously I have a little bit of bias as a healthcare provider and somebody got shot already, but it's up to everyone to kind of look through what the risks are, what they see in the data. I just want to make sure, as things circulate, as there's rumors that circulate, as new articles come out here and there, that they're getting information from an accurate source. So when you go to make the decision, make sure you're making the right decision for you. Make sure you have the data. Make sure you have it in your head, that it's not nanobots that are being injected into your body or anything along those lines. But know the data, know the risks, know the benefits, and then make the educated decision for yourself.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. I would like to thank the 505 CCW family for tuning in today, and to those who sent in questions. We appreciate and are grateful for the conversation. Finally, Colonel Weinbrecht, Chief Thompson, our panel members, Ms. Henley, and everyone who worked behind the scenes to make this event possible and a success. Thank you for giving us a forum to ask questions and for opening the door for this incredibly important conversation. This concludes the COVID vaccine Q&A. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.